Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. I hope that you're having a wonderful week. This has been quite a thrilling week for me, as I mentioned in my Friday wins, because I finally had a chance to revisit my polyamory book draft. So I finished the drafting process back in October, and then got sidelined with a bunch of other projects that needed my attention. So this is the first chance that I've had to get back to it. So it's been very exciting to see it all coming together, and that should be finished up in the next 24 hours or so. So very thrilled about that. So I had a request to do a Facebook Live on the experience of not feeling trans enough. And I know this is quite a common experience, and I know a bunch of people in here posted around acceptance of bodies in trans communities. And so I thought this would be a good topic for Friday. I've been enjoying the continuing conversation around victim consciousness and how that plays into leadership. So I will get on and do a Facebook Live eventually about that. And I have another one planned about opening the flow of money, because I know that this is also a big concern for folks. So we have that to look forward to. But for tonight, the experience of not feeling trans enough and how this plays out. So I mentioned in here before that when I lived in Minneapolis back in 2003, then I sang in a trans chorus called Trans Voices. I think it was the second ever trans chorus on the planet. And though I had been out as trans for 8 years at that point, during my whole experience with that choir, I just never felt legitimate as a trans person. I was always comparing myself to those around me and always feeling less than, especially since at the time when I was not on hormones. And so, we do this to one another all the time. So when I did eventually go on hormones, and I started growing facial hair pretty quickly, a couple of my trans guy friends who had been on hormones longer than me kept threatening to come over in the middle of the night and to shave me in the middle of the night because they were jealous of my facial hair. And even currently, though my biggest problem as a trans person is probably that I am continually read as a cisgender man, which is not remotely how I identify, and it is pretty horrifying to me, though I know that that is a problem that a lot of trans people would actually like to have. Part of me still feels defensive about the fact that, I've gone on hormones and I haven't had any surgeries, even though I'm not planning for that. And despite the fact that I identify as trans and not as a man, and feel very happy with my body at this point, don't plan to have any surgeries, then, in some corner in the back of my mind is still that story that, real trans people have the list of surgeries, even though that's not what I personally feel that I want or need. And I'm currently counseling a 15-year-old who's coming out as trans, and they are in a panic because they are feeling so behind in their transition. And so they are seeing people on social media who, have been out as trans. They knew they were trans when they were 5. And so my client is feeling insecure, like they should be further along. At 15, at 15, gosh, I just had no idea who I was. So I can't even imagine feeling at 15 like already you're behind. And so, why do we put such pressure on ourselves and on one another? And why do we feel like our journeys are supposed to be just like everyone else's? Even in a community where, the whole premise of the community is that you don't have to follow all of those external standards. You get to invent your own journey. And why do we waste so much time and energy comparing ourselves to others, which usually means that we find ourselves to be failing? And so one thing that I have learned from being out as trans for over a long period of time, and in various parts of the country and in the world, since I lived in South Africa for a year and a half, is that such community standards are actually highly variable. So let's give a couple of examples. So when I was living in Minneapolis, then trans people who were quote living full time and on full medical journeys were considered to be the real trans people. And the rest of us, since I was not on hormones at the time, were labeled as quote just genderqueer. And so I always felt very much less than in that context. And so then when I moved to Missouri and I went on hormones, then there the standards were the opposite. And so there, the genderqueer folks were the cool ones who were blurring the binary. And those of us who were, quote, living full time and on full medical journeys were considered, old dinosaurs, sellouts to the patriarchy and pathetically invested in the gender binary. And so that really helped me to realize, as with any aspect of gender, then what is seen as superior and appropriate is not universal and fixed, but is actually highly variable over space and time. And so, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say tonight in this video, in response to the person who requested it, I could tell you that, you're beautiful as you are, or that you are authentic, or that you're trans enough. But I know that that is not going to help. And so what I think might help is, pondering why is it that we don't feel trans enough. So I was pondering this myself this week as I was doing the dishes, and this is what I realized. And that is because being trans is a gender, and that is what gender does. Is one of the main ways that we experience the world feeling not good enough. And so, women are constantly striving after impossible beauty standards, never feeling enough, even if they're size 0. And the very nature of masculinity is that it is an impossible ideal. And so that's why men do so many of the terrible things that they do, because they are trying to prove themselves as men. And so, as trans people, then, we feel not trans enough in our relationship to gender. And so, my question for you is what is it that we are going to do as trans leaders about that? So how are we going to stand up to that oppression inside of ourselves and in our own communities? Since we have the ability as trans leaders to set the direction and tone and priorities in our communities. So Bobby posted about planning to open a LGBT center themselves. And so, how do we change these normative standards and realize that, in some ways, we are no different than the other shitty genders. But we claim that we are contesting gender standards. Are we really doing that? Or are we just holding ourselves to a different oppressive standard? And so how could we step up the work that we're doing so that it is genuinely liberatory? Since this issue causes a lot of pain for folks, and a lot of folks in this group have posted about how much it sucks to not only feel rejected by mainstream society, but also to be told that we're not good enough, even within our own community. And so what are we going to do to change that? Many people posted in here when I asked about what trans communities most need, that is the one dynamic that they really want to change. And so we are the change makers. And so rather than wishing that it magically changes or waiting for someone else to do it, then what can we do right now to start shifting that dynamic? And I'd really love to hear your ideas. And so please post your suggestions. So, hey, Mo, welcome. So yeah, I was just talking about since these oppressive standards in our own communities are so painful to people, and since we are a group of trans leaders, then what are we going to do to change those norms in our own communities, since we are the ones who are empowered to set the tone? So if you have any ideas about that or any questions, feel free to go ahead and post that. And otherwise, I hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend, and I will check in probably on Sunday when all my drafting is done. Maybe I will get on and do the video about opening the flow of money. So look forward to connecting with you again then.